Hello, everybody. This semester, I'm going to be trying to do more lectures. I'm not going to make any promises, but I do want to kick us off with the progressive era. So you're going to be taking notes. So please, fast forward my voice if you want to go at a little bit of a quicker pace. I'm sure you know how to do that on YouTube. But also pause the video when you need to write things down because I am asking you to write everything down. You can shorten some words, you can shorten some ideas, but basically every slide has very important information that I want to make sure that you have written down in your notes. So make sure to pause the video as we go. Okay, so this is the Gilded Age. Oops, sorry. Okay, we're good. This is the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. Now, the timeline is going to be interesting here as we start Module 7 because there actually is a really important topic that kind of happens right in the middle of these two topics. But I think these two themes go together really well, which is why I want to teach about the Progressive Era. The Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, there's a quick little summary. The Gilded Age, you guys know, is when America is transforming from an agrarian to an increasingly industrial and urbanized society. So, you know this. We have this huge industrial revolution, we have this massive boom of cities. There's a lot of changes and a lot of advancements happening. But although this transformation created new economic opportunities, it also created societal problems that were addressed by a variety of reform efforts. So, just as a reminder, you remember this. To be gilded means to be covered thinly with gold. It represents the wealthy and the privileged. Mark Twain called this time period the Gilded Age because it looked glittery on the outside, but there's actually a lot of corruption underneath. Well, who's going to address that corruption? Enter flow, the progressive era. To be progressive or progressing means to proceed step by step. Think about progress. Look at the definition in green. The progressive era is a time period in which the goal was to restore economic opportunities and correct injustices in American life. A progressive person is someone advocating or implementing social reform or new ideas. So here we have two complementary time periods. The Gilded Age, make sure you have those rough dates. Roughly 1860, I put 1869 to 1889, but you can be a little less specific with those dates if you want. Just roughly know it's kind of during the Reconstruction is when it starts, and then it ends around the 1890s. And of course, that time period is filled with advancements, but problems. Well, we enter the Progressive Era. Starting in 1890 to 1920, we see a lot of attempted solutions. Some of them are amazing, some of them don't really work, which we will discuss in this lecture. Okay, again, make sure that this definition is highlighted, is starred, is very important because this is the Progressive Era. Basically, it's a time period where people are trying to change America for the better. You're going to see a lot of political changes, a lot of economic changes, and a lot of social changes. In fact, around the same time that you're going to be watching this lecture, you're going to be doing this giant chart of problems and solutions. And yes, I know you're going to be overwhelmed by how many things happened during this time period. But guys, isn't it cool that we get to be overwhelmed by good things happening in America? I know that's not perfect, but it's pretty awesome that we have so many advancements, so many progressive things happen. So don't get overwhelmed, get excited by all the wonderful changes that are happening in America during this time period. Okay, what are the goals of the Progressive Era? What are they specifically trying to do? Number 1, protect social welfare. Basically, helping out people is what number 1 is referring to. Things are going to pop up and people are going to pop up that are specifically just motivated. How do we help the least of these? How do we help children? How do we give services to people who are down on their luck, people that are in poverty, people that are being oppressed, people that are struggling? How do we help our communities? So feel free, if you don't know what the YMCA is, if you don't know what the Salvation Army is, look those up. They're basically organizations that are set up to help people. Florence Kelly specifically was a child's rights activist, really trying to get kids out of these dangerous environments, dangerous work environments, and trying to protect them and get them back in school, get them back in safe areas, away from abuse. Number 2, promote moral improvement. Now, this one's kind of interesting. The progressive era has a lot of different groups that pop up that are trying to morally improve our country. Alcohol has been a terrible issue in our country. We have very little laws that are limiting people's alcohol consumption. Therefore, there's a lot of abuses and a lot of terrible things happening with alcohol. So the progressive era is when we get the prohibition movement, the movement to get rid of alcohol, which they successfully do with the 18th Amendment, literally saying we cannot make, sell, or transport alcohol at all in our country. We also get groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Temperance, again, means no alcohol. And you know this has been a theme with women's rights movements ever since the 1800s. They've been fighting for temperance. So it took them 100 years, but they finally are trying to morally improve our country. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Okay, goal number 3, create economic reform. Okay, this is kind of complicated-ish. They do want to help out workers. They want to get workers minimum wage. They want workers to not work so many hours. They want to protect the little guy. They want to bust these monopolies. They want to fix that wealth gap that you've learned about from the Gilded Age. But we also get elements of socialism during this time period. Now, there's extreme socialism being talked about, of kind of economic equality with everyone. But there's also just hints at socialism, basically coming from this idea of maybe frustration that they are billionaires and billionaires, like our good friends Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, Vanderbilt. And then there's all these other people that are barely surviving. So these hints at socialism come from a place of wanting to maybe help out the whole country. You'll see that more. And last one is foster efficiency. What does that mean? That basically means to make things work smarter, work better. Assembly lines. What can we do to still make a lot of products in America, but do it in a smarter way? The progressive era definitely has a little bit of that as well. If I had to argue the 2 biggest goals of the progressive era, I would say it's number 1 and number 3. We're going to see a lot of those happen. Okay, this is going to take some time, but this is where I want you to pause the video you've probably already paused it a couple times, hopefully, but I need you to look at that chart that we already did in class, the problems and the solutions chart. And I need you to write down some of that information. Just in case you lose that Google Doc or somehow Canvas locks us out, we want to have some major successes of the movement, of the era. You can break it down like this. What are some social changes that you see in that chart? What are some economic changes that you see? What are some political changes? If you have a printer, I would just print out the chart. But if you don't have a printer, you might have to be writing down the names of all these laws, all these programs It's probably going to take you about 15 minutes to write it all down, but make sure you do. Write down key important ones that maybe stick out to you, or write down the whole list of successful things in the progressive era. Okay, now we enter a part of the lecture that is honestly my favorite. Let me take a drink of water because these people are literally so amazing. One of the reasons why I love history is I love learning about ordinary, regular people that fought for good in our country. Like, yes, I like the presidents and I like the leaders of certain movements. Those people are great, but usually everyone already knows their names. There are people like this I'm about to teach you about that you may not know their name. Hopefully you will after this. But they are people that saw problems in America and didn't just sit by and let it remain a problem. They dedicated their life to making America better, and I think they're pretty awesome. So they have a funny nickname. They're called muckrakers. Muckrakers. Think of the word muck. What does that sound like to you? Muck is kind of like dirt or grime or just something gross. And think of someone who's raking something, like in this picture. Muckrakers are cleaning America. They are raking up the dirt. They are exposing the problems. So look to the right, make sure you're writing this down. Muckrakers are members of the press that investigated corruption in order to expose problems to the American people. They had a great amount of influence, often resulting in the passage of laws designed to reform the abuse that they reported. So, ladies and gentlemen, I now introduce to you some of my favorite people in history, the muckrakers. First, we got Thomas Nast. No, this is not a picture of him, but this is a cartoon that he drew. Over each muckraker, you're going to see the subject and the results. Means kind of like, what are they trying to expose? What's the muck that they're trying to deal with? And what were the results? So Thomas Nast, you might already recognize that name. He draws a lot of cartoons. So he's an artist in the newspapers and all around. And his subject was political corruption. Lincoln Steffens is another person who was writing about the same topic. So in fact, you actually get two muckrakers in this slide. Nast and Steffens are both trying to expose political corruption. One of their biggest targets was this guy named Boss Tweed. Does that ring a bell at all? He was the leader of something called Tammany Hall in New York City. It was this place where, if you remember, Irish immigrants went to. But he was taking advantage of them. And he was taking advantage of the power that he had in politics. And so what was happening is Lincoln Steffens and Thomas Nast just didn't quit attacking this guy. Thomas Nast drew this very famous picture of Boss Tweed, implying that he's sketchy, he's doing something illegal, specifically with money. Well, what were the results of his muckraking? Tweed was convicted of embezzlement, which is theft, and he went to prison and he died in prison. But this is an example of Thomas Nast even using cartoons as a way to expose the problems in America. But don't forget about Lincoln Steffens. He was writing about the same stuff too. Oh, I love Jacob Riis. He's a photographer. Specifically, he put all of his photographs in a compilation called How the Other Half Lives. What is the muck that he's trying to expose? The living conditions of the urban poor. So Jacob Riis would go around and he would take pictures of what it was like for a poor person to live in the cities. One of the coolest things I find about Jacob Riis is that he was one of the first ones to use flash photography. So think about that. He can now expose physically things that would be hidden in the dark. And so he would go around the cities, he would go in the tenements. You remember that, right? Those are the kind of crowded apartments that people are living in. And he would take pictures of life in the darkness as a poor person in the city. One of his famous pictures is the one you're looking at. That is a real picture of children sleeping in a gutter. Where are their parents? Are they alone? Is this where they live? Is anybody helping them? Pictures like this would have people ask a lot of questions. They would also ask, how can we help? How can we help these children? The reason why the book is called How the Other Half Lives is because Jacob Riis, he held these nights where he would invite very important rich people, and he would kind of do like a slideshow, and he would show picture after picture showing these rich people how the other half lives. Man, what were the results? Well, the slide says that New York City passed building codes to promote safety and health. That is true. And people also donated money to different organizations to try to get these kids, try to get the quality of life for poor people in cities, to try to help improve that. So yes, we did try to clean up the tenements, but things like foster care gets created during this time, orphanages, different people rise up and create organizations to help the less fortunate. This is another really famous picture by Jacob Riis. Maybe you've seen it before. This is exposing directly what life was like in the tenements. It shows just a crowded, very non-hygienic area to live in. And again, he's exposing a really dark part of American history that maybe people don't see until they see photographs like this. Okay, we got two Idas, so make sure that you know which one's which, okay? So Ida B. Wells wrote a book called A Red Record. The muck that she's trying to expose is the lynching of African Americans. So she wrote a book, again, that literally provides statistics on the lynchings of Black Americans. And this is crazy because obviously we are years and years past the end of slavery, but you guys know that our problems in our country regarding race are nowhere gone. Lynchings are being hung on a tree, murdered, and they were happening at a crazy amount in the South. But if you lived in the North, sometimes you wouldn't even hear about it. Sometimes you wouldn't even know that this was a problem. So what she did was made it very clear for people that this is muck. This is a problem. And she put it in the red record. Now, the results maybe are not as strong as what you and I would like. There's an organization called the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Now, they join in on the fight of an anti-lynching legislation. But does anything else happen? No. Does the government come hard on lynchings, and do they go out and seek and find these people? No. So this is actually one of the failures of the progressive era, is not a lot was done for people of color. Ida B. Wells tried, but didn't fully succeed in her muckraking. Not to any fault of hers. The government just wasn't listening. Louis Hine, another photographer. What is his subject? Okay, National Child Labor Committee commissioned Hine to take pictures of child labor to pressure Congress into changing laws. What he did, and you can look up his photos online as well, is again, he's exposing the problem of child labor specifically. Photos like this, of this little girl in this factory. There are so many that are similar to this. I'll show you more in class, but they are just heartbreaking. There's this one of this little girl looking out the window, and it just makes me think like they don't want to be at work. Their family is making them work, people are making them work, and they'd actually rather be at school, or they'd actually rather be anywhere else than this scary, dirty factory. And so Lewis Hine is making this a deal, making this important by showing you pictures of what really is happening in America. And during the Progressive Era, we will get child labor laws. Okay, here's our other Ida. Ida Tarbell. She wrote the book History of Standard Oil. Guys, I think this is so cool. She brought down Rockefeller's company. Now, okay, I remember you guys. A lot of you liked Rockefeller. You thought he was smart. You thought he was a captain of industry. Well, a lot of people during the time period thought that his tactics were pretty ruthless. So she actually wrote and took interviews and did all this research and wrote this book called The History of Standard Oil. This book actually caused Standard Oil to go to a court case, thanks to maybe Teddy Roosevelt as well. It was declared a monopoly officially. No hiding, no separating. Standard Oil was declared a monopoly. Monopolies are illegal, and Standard Oil was broken up. Again, you can have your own opinions about Rockefeller, but having a monopoly, not allowing other businesses to pop up in that industry, many people thought that was hurting our country. So Ida Tarbell thought that that was muck, and she raked it up. I can't believe that a woman author brought down one of the most powerful men in America at this time. Change is possible. Okay, we're almost done. Bear with me. Again, these guys are freaking amazing. They deserve even more than I'm giving them, but I'm trying to boil it down for you. Okay, Upton Sinclair, another author. Man, you can do a lot with writing, can't you? He went undercover and he wrote a book called The Jungle. Very different from the Jungle Book with Mowgli and Disney. This is not the same book. This is called The Jungle, and it investigated dangerous working conditions and unsanitary procedures in the meatpacking industry. Guys, I will show you like a paragraph or two from this book because what he describes is happening is absolutely disgusting. There's no health codes, there's no laws, there's just disgusting things in the meat factory, and he exposed all of it. And so, as a result, 2 different laws were passed to kind of bring that health code safety into the meat pack industry, but also foods and drugs in general. Okay, I think this is our last muckraker. Her name is Jane Addams, and she is going to create something called settlement houses. Most famously, the one in Chicago is called the Hull House. Hull House. The subject is she's trying to provide services in large cities for immigrants and poor people. She's noticing that they are getting abused, oppressed, and she wants to support this population of people. The results, man, did it take off. Other social welfare organizations kept popping up. This is where we get the social worker profession. I don't know if there's anyone out there that wants to be a social worker, but Jane Addams should be your hero because of her bravery of starting things like this, it led to so many wonderful things in our country. Look at all the social services that were created because of the settlement houses. Child daycare was offered at the settlement houses, kindergarten classes, English classes, citizenship test trainings, libraries, gyms, all of these things to just help immigrants and help people who are in poverty. So she's pretty amazing. Okay, so those were our muckrakers. Again, I just love them so much because I'm willing to bet maybe you knew one of them, maybe. And I just think it's cool to highlight the people in America that, again, they weren't a president, they weren't a governor, they weren't this crazy famous person. They were just ordinary people trying to make America better. But we can't not talk about our presidents because they did have a big hand in implementing the muckrakers' change. So we have 3 progressive presidents. First, Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Please take a note that Teddy Roosevelt served 2 terms. He's a Republican. Taft served 1 term as a Republican, and Woodrow Wilson served 2 terms, but as a Democrat. Okay? So the progressives didn't have a particular party. You can see that we have Republicans and Democrats that might see themselves as progressive. So Teddy Roosevelt, this is a big slide. I'm not going to read everything, but make sure you pause and write all this down because this is his main slide. These are his accomplishments as a progressive president. So in fact, I should have put this at the top, but look at the very bottom. It says the square deal. This was like his branding for what he was doing during the progressive era. A square deal means like a fair deal. So he's like, okay, America, we're going to make America better. Here's the fair deal. He wants to do consumer protection, meaning protecting people who buy stuff, corporate regulation, breaking down monopolies, and conservation of natural resources. Again, protecting our environment. So if you look back at the top, conservationism is a huge thing for Teddy Roosevelt. He protects part of the environment, like national parks is, you do not take anything from that national park. It is protected by the government. We're not going to drill oil in a national park. We're not going to cut down trees in a national park. We are protecting our national parks. But conservation also means that you're kind of using the environment to benefit you some way. So you can see in the second act that is listed, we get canals being created, dams being created, reservoirs, and all of those are being created for electrical power. So yes, we may chop down some trees, we may build a man-made canal, we may stop a river. So that's the idea of conservation. We do protect the environment sometimes, fully, but we also use it to our advantage other times. The other thing he's super famous for is trust busting. So think of trust as being very similar to monopoly. He is breaking through monopolies. He's breaking them up. The Sherman Antitrust Act was a law beforehand, but it was super weak. And no president was actually implementing it. But now he is, and he's creating other things, other acts. The ICC, which is from the chart, if you remember, he's trying to create these other groups and laws that are trying to break up monopolies, or at least watch over companies in order to maybe break them up. One of the big things you should know about Teddy Roosevelt is he did allow some monopolies to exist. I should say some trust to exist, merging of companies. He did see that there were some good trusts that actually helped the economy, but he also did see some merging of companies actually hurting the economy. So if they helped, he kept them. If he thought they were hurting the economy, he broke them up. Like 40 companies, he broke them up. And then that consumer protection is really the safe food regulations. Do you remember Upton Sinclair? Well, somebody read his book, Teddy Roosevelt did, and was like, shoot, we got to change that. So Upton Sinclair inspired Teddy Roosevelt to then, boom, pass these laws, which you need that president to kind of listen to the American people. Taft is the president after Roosevelt. There's not a lot on his slide. He was a big trust buster. He actually even did twice the number of trust busting than in Roosevelt. But part of that is because he didn't see a difference between good or bad trusts. Taft was even firmer on not liking companies merging. So he did break down a lot of companies. Now, this is kind of a crazy moment. There's no law right now in history, like not in 2021, but like right now in history, there's no law that says you can't go more than 2 terms. Everyone was doing 2 terms as president because that's what George Washington started, but there was no law saying you couldn't go for a 3rd term. Well, when Taft was breaking up all these trusts, it kind of offended Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was kind of training Taft to take over after him, and he didn't like that Taft was breaking up trusts that Roosevelt thought was okay. So Roosevelt actually came back to get a 3rd term. Taft is running for his 2nd term. Teddy Roosevelt comes back and is like, well, I don't want you to be president anymore, so I'm going to run for the 3rd term. And that's where this picture comes from. They're both Republican. They both are progressive. They differ on this one issue, but they definitely split the vote. Some Republicans voted for Taft. Some Republicans voted for Roosevelt. Believe it or not, their party name was called the Bull Moose Party. Yeah, weird. But they were progressive people who liked Teddy Roosevelt. So when Republicans split their vote, that is the perfect time for a Democrat to step in. So again, progressive does not mean Democrat or Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive and happens to be a Democrat. So what great timing when the Republican Party is divided to step in and take control. His program is called New Freedom. Remember, Roosevelt's is called the Square Deal. Wilson's is called the New Freedom. One of the things he wants to do is he wants to lower tariffs. Tariffs are taxes on imports coming into our country. And so he lowered tariffs, which definitely made a lot of people happy, made a lot of businesses happy too. He does want to eliminate trusts. He has no distinction between good or bad trusts. He doesn't like them. He made his own law, the Clayton Antitrust Act. So again, you see that big theme between Taft, Roosevelt, and Wilson is this idea of anti-monopoly, antitrust. He also wants to reform the banking system with the Federal Reserve Act. I don't want to read all of that, but as you're writing it in your notes, you can just see that we're becoming a lot more unified through this law with the Federal Reserve Act. Wilson also is going to pop up a lot when you read about the women's rights movement during the Progressive era. The women's rights movement has been fighting for, since 1776 for the right to vote. But you guys remember specifically after the Civil War, when Black American men got the right to vote, the women's rights movement was super angry. A lot of them were super angry because they're like, what? We want the right to vote. So we're in the 1900s now, and they still don't have the right to vote. And so you're going to see Wilson's name pop up a lot because the women's rights movement is kicking up, and they're saying enough time has passed. We deserve the right to vote. Yeah. I have to read the one on the bottom right. Look at this. President Wilson is deceiving the world when he appears as the prophet of democracy. President Wilson has opposed those who demand democracy for this country. He is responsible for the disfranchisement of millions of Americans. We in America know this. The world will find him out. If you don't know, they're actually talking about World War I. When Wilson takes America into World War I, he calls himself, the country of democracy. Look how great America is. And women are like, you're not as great as you think. We don't have the right to vote. So they're pretty bold. with these posters. Okay, are you still with me? Did you fall asleep? Did you get super bored? Because we're at the very end of our presentation, which is the failures of the progressive era. Now, guys, I'm not going to lie. I really like this time period. I just love the positivity. I love that people are fighting for change and that they're actually seeing it happen. I love that our country is taking one step forward. I know, I'm not naive. I know that the country was not made perfect. I know that not every problem was solved. But man, after Reconstruction, after the Gilded Age, I just needed something good to happen in America. And I feel like, a lot of good things definitely happened during this time period. But I do have to give you the complete story. I hinted to it before, but there are definitely failures of this time period as well. So let's dive into it. One of the failures, kind of mentioned this before, is that there were internal contradictions. There was contradictory goals that impeded the efforts of reformers and often pitted political leaders against each other, most dramatically in the Republican Party. So look at the next paragraph. For instance, national progressive leaders such as Theodore Roosevelt argued for increased federal regulation to coordinate big business, while others, such as Wilson, promoted to legislate for open competition. What does that mean? Basically means that Roosevelt and Wilson are both progressive. However, Roosevelt wants the federal government to be more controlling over big business, while Wilson wants the government to be less controlling over business. Both of them don't like monopolies, but they have different ways of accomplishing their goals. Think also about Roosevelt and Taft. Their disagreements on trusts actually divided their party rather than bring the party together. Oh, this is that same thing that I just mentioned, the whole bull moose party situation. There was no progressive party. There were progressives everywhere. And I guess the one moment where the progressives tried to form a party was this one, the Bull Moose Party, but it really just stole Republican votes and didn't really go anywhere after that. The worst problem, in my opinion, is exclusivity. The progressive movement was pretty much restricted to white, Protestant, educated, middle-class people. Racism often pervaded most progressive reform efforts, as evidenced by the suffrage movement. Specifically, as women campaigned for the vote, most progressives argued on behalf of female suffrage as a necessary reform to combat the influence of corrupted or ignorant Black voters in the election booth. Gosh, that's a terrible summary, but I want to tell you what's actually happening. Well, one, there was racism in the women's rights movement. Let's just start there. Even in some of the marches and the protests, white women are in the front of these protests, and Black women and women of color are in the back. And then some people were only supporting women voting because they just hated Black people voting so much. So in the progressive era, it's not like it's kumbaya, everybody coming together to help everyone. No. There's definitely internal motives that are geared through racism as well. Civil rights and progressive reforms were pretty much separated, even though they shouldn't have been. Remember Ida B. Wells? She wrote A Red Record. You'd think if people cared about immigrants, if people wanted to support poor people, you'd think they also want to stop lynchings. But no. There definitely were not a lot of advancements for people of color during this time, even though this seemed like the time where it could have happened. The progressive era was still limited in its scope. The last thing that is kind of a failure of the progressive era is that the federal court system didn't always support them. So people could protest, people could march, certain groups of government could even support certain laws. But if the courts don't approve it, then it won't happen. And even if the courts approved it, there was often a lack of resources and a lack of money to fully implement the change. So sadly, even if something awesome got passed in a law, sometimes there wouldn't be enough money to actually make it happen. So then unfortunately it becomes just a lot of talk and not a lot of walk. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the progressive era. I'm zooming back to the very beginning. Incredibly important that you remember the problems of the Gilded Age and that you analyze the progressive era in light of that. How successful was the progressive era? What are some of the things that changed during this time period? How did the progressive era change our country politically, economically, and socially? Those are some key ideas to keep in the back of your mind as we continue with this topic. Thanks for making it. You got it, guys. Like, you did it. I know it was a long one, but I am so proud of you.